By all accounts, Prey 2017 is a game I should love. It's sci-fi, it's horror, it doesn't shove the story down your throat all the time. But as much as I even want to just like the game, I don't. It's not even that it's parading around dressed up as System Shock 2, it's how the story it tells ultimately doesn't fit with the gameplay's own philosophy. System Shock 2's descendants in the immersive sim genre, including Bioshock and Dishonored, all feature reasonably intricate gameplay systems, as long as it involves interacting in a physical way with whatever or whoever's around. This is all well and good, but at least the modern incarnations of the genre don't thread this open-ended approach into their narratives. With Bioshock, the story was pushed front and center, paraded around as a deep exploration of the nature of games and of morality, while the latter is about as far from the truth as possible. The question of do you want to murder children for your own gain is rather boorish and has an equally dull answer. Yes, killing children and lacking empathy is wrong, but the rest of Bioshock at least made motions towards something less trite. Since then, the immersive sim genre has had a healthy set of releases with deep enough systems and good enough level design to allow those systems to breathe comfortably. Where it's business as usual is in the narrative department. Both in execution and material, these games slavishly follow Bioshock's example. The world brims with possibilities and philosophical questions until we get to the plot. Once we're there, all the openness of the gameplay falls away, and it's time for a good old-fashioned morality play. I don't even have a particular problem with morality plays themselves. I've sort of written a few myself. It's that these specific morality plays don't go anywhere interesting. Practically every immersive sim I've played focuses on the question of, do the ends justify the means, then proceeds clearly to say no. The openness found in these games is usually tied to the decision of, do you want to kill people? I understand that all these games are first-person shooters, but hitching yourself to the combat wagon and then giving players a report card on their morality destroys any interest in the act of killing, outside of the primal catharsis it provides, of course. The problem with many difficult ethical questions is that their answers are often as complex as the questions themselves. So if a game decides to score your morality, it's limiting the questions it can ask to the simple, easy-to-answer ones. Is murdering random people okay? Isn't a particularly interesting or deep question. Is murdering this person okay? Becomes more interesting when that person has done something bad, but again, these games like having some kind of answer to these questions. So, murder is bad and you should feel bad for doing it regardless of what this person's will is or your own intent. Much of ethics revolves around intent and even the question of whether intent matters. If a game wants to present you an ethical dilemma, it either follows the Infinity Engine RPG route of giving you 15 options for dealing with a problem to get some breadth of intent, even if that intent ultimately doesn't matter, or intent simply isn't mentioned at all. One of the simplest questions in ethics is whether or not an action is ethical based on its outcome alone, or if intent plays a role. While the road to hell is often paved with good intentions, it's still difficult to condemn someone for taking actions they genuinely believe were helpful, in all but the most extreme cases. And this is why this particular question doesn't have a definitive answer. Intent will always play a role in building difficult decisions, hence the RPG's solution of trying to cover as many of them as possible. A decision becomes far more personal when you can specify your intent, even if it's never brought up again. When games without the penchant for dialogue enter into the ethical dilemma arena, they have no way of understanding your intent without some kind of prompt. The irony here is that the immersion these games build specifically prevents them from asking for the player's intent, all in the name of seamlessness. The writers and designers then have to make assumptions and decisions about each situation if they want each decision to have some weight. Barring that, you're stuck with the same decision each time, a la Bioshock, or the flawed logic of Dishonored's poetic justice being deemed the good option. I don't think handing a woman over to her stalker is morally better than murdering her, but the game seems to think so. So we're stuck between a rock and a hard place. Either design and writing effort is put towards the web of dialogue and intent in a CRPG, or something akin to the Systems in Prom Week, a great little project by UCSC, or the game is filled with arbitrary judgments by writers and designers like in Bioshock, Dishonored, and Prey. When I say arbitrary, it's from the point of necessity. The designers and writers wanted some kind of answer and they're stuck making a decision, and without real discussion with the player, that judgment is arbitrary. By their nature, they can't take intent or other reasonably ethical decisions into account as they don't fit the worldview presented in the narrative. There is, however, a third, underused option. Underused because it's horribly uncomfortable for most people. Luckily, I'm not most people, and this option happens to be in many of my favorite games, usually because it's the cheaper option. See my video on cheap stories for a little more. This option is simple. Don't react, just allow. Between the level of writing needed to execute on this option and the faith needed in players, it's a risky goal to shoot for. When done right, a community will spring up debating the ramifications of various choices, which was the correct one, or even if there was a correct one. Ultimately, this is one of the points I made in my Dark Souls video, but it's an interesting one nonetheless. Humans naturally seek out meaning and latch on hard whenever they find it. If they can't find it, they'll make their own. This is what simply allowing players to act and leaving it at that does. It forces people to think about their actions or ignore them entirely. And that simple choice in and of itself is a major part of ethics. A person not wanting to reflect on a decision says just as much as whatever conclusion a person may come upon. Take that statement as you will, but one of the common viewpoints in philosophy is that reflection is all but mandatory to lead a moral life. The side quests in Dark Souls are one of the simplest examples of this. Finish them and the other character either dies or becomes a hollow. What's better, bringing them to despair or letting their ignorance remain? Does helping Siegmeyer on his journey do him any good? Had you not helped him, he'd still be alive. Is a life of meaninglessness better than a meaningful death? Is it better for his daughter to kill him or for her never to find him? Dark Souls never answers these questions. It simply allows you to decide, or not depending on how much you're paying attention, and then leaves you to stew in your own thoughts. Less is more here, and none of these answers are particularly good in the traditional sense. The problem with this approach is the discomfort and apparent lack of conclusiveness it builds. 3 games later, and the Dark Souls community is still debating the ramifications of the endings and what it could all mean. This couldn't happen if there was more explanation at the end. So where does this leave Prey? I'm happy that Prey is a step in the right direction for the immersive sim genre. It does a more subtle job of presenting ethical dilemmas, but it still drops the ball as far as making those decisions about life and death gray, even if saving people is more resource intensive and difficult than ever. Again, Prey subjects us to an attempted plot twist that only cheapens its ethical choices by thrusting its own judgments into the spotlight. Prey does manage to do something with this tired ending by allowing you to judge the other main character's actions, if you played correctly that is, but for me at least that's not enough. We're still back to the question of the ends justifying the means. It's certainly framed better, and because of that it's a grayer answer than we're often given, but it still is ultimately a decision about whether to murder someone or not. Here we are. A game about empathy and systemic storytelling boils its ending down to a simple, does this man deserve to die, prompt. Because of the rest of the game's context, it becomes a decently interesting question, but there's a bit of irony here. You're prompted to take the character's hand as your last choice. The rest of the time, the game tries to skirt around direct prompts, and this is how it ends, with a prompt. I'm happy it doesn't get too preachy about this last decision, but I wish the rest of the game was left to its own devices instead of judging you like a proud moralist without regard for anyone else's perspective. You might be thinking, but that's the point of Prey, to judge players on how they behave on their own. Here's the thing. Prey is designed to be as open as possible from a mechanical and geographic standpoint and actively encourages experimentation. Then because the story is presumably about morality and empathy, you're judged on how you indulged yourself, or didn't. My real problem is how two-faced the game is without feeling like it earns it. It desperately wants you to toy around with everything and experience what it has to offer in your own way, all the while silently judging you before giving you a report card at the end. While the story aspires to make all your actions meaningful, outside of simple resource management, the gameplay can't hold up its end of the bargain. One of the better mechanical flourishes is how using neuromods will eventually make turrets hostile to you. Unfortunately, they're the only ones who get this treatment, out of necessity for the ending's twist, and none of the friendly characters react to your splicing. Most of the optional content is there to flesh out Talos 1 and Transtar as a whole, and has little to do with the narrative's themes other than continuing the tradition of science reaching past morality and understanding in science fiction. Again, there's nothing inherently wrong with this, but had the ending not been akin to a report card, the emphasis on exploration over reactivity wouldn't feel so jarring. I'll give the fake cook story some credit as far as basic morality goes. He's willing to kill himself to kill you, which, while not making him that interesting, gives you a bit of perspective on your character. He's killing people who performed terrible experiments on him, and while he clearly has mental problems, his motives are understandable. You might even agree with him. But even this little piece of optional content shows the cracks of trying to moralize like this. All the possible gray area built around this one character is scrubbed away once it has to fit into some kind of predefined morality system. He's bad because he kills people, and is ultimately cartoonishly evil in how he's written. Yours or his intent doesn't matter. He's going to die unless you stun him, and he won't ever wake up, freeing us from grappling with the ramifications of a murderer walking around. There's still a ton of negative possibility space here left unexplored. Instead, freedom of navigation and traditional gameplay were prioritized. I know resources aren't infinite, and that human interaction is more difficult to build than combat and movement, but we're still running into problems with morality and writing from at least a decade ago, with only minor improvements to show for it. As a side note, I find it curious that the mind-controlled staff's deaths don't count against you unless you actively press buttons to kill them. You're still ultimately the cause of their death if they run up to you and blow their heads up, but it's okay. You didn't want to kill them. Or maybe you meant to, who knows? You just weren't careful enough. The fact that the game doesn't judge you that harshly makes its story's preachiness all the weaker, when it could have so easily created some genuine difficulty in reaching the moral high ground. Instead, collateral damage doesn't matter, even if it's a very real, very human problem. You could make the argument that it's not the game's job to tell you how to feel about stuff like this, but then why have the morality system in the endings as written in the first place? Ultimately, Prey is still limited by its chosen genre. There's too much filler combat in service of chasing the specter of survival horror. This pushes almost all the character development into non-interactive reading and incredibly one-sided conversations. You can still connect and even empathize with these characters beyond them just being people, but it's stilted and hasn't really evolved much beyond Bioshock 2's iteration. Prey is a small step on the long road to what the big-budget industry sees as immersion, and what I see as the homogenization of games, but it's a welcome one. It actually executes on some of its philosophical aspirations and at least tries to put in some of what I'd call real RPG elements. Its slavish devotion to fitting into a combat-focused genre isn't doing it any favors, and unfortunately that's where most of its open-endedness resides. There are a few games out there that are open on both narrative and gameplay fronts. They're often challenging. They're often weird. They're often games I love.